Great columns of smoke and fire adorn the maritime postcard of the Persian Gulf. It is January 1991, and the greatest naval confrontation of the Great War is unfolding, with the United States and Iraq as the main protagonists. The conflict in the region began a few months earlier when Saddam Hussein's regime decided to invade the small emirate of Kuwait to seize its oil. Now, an international coalition led by Washington is showing all its power in the fierce Battle of Bubiyan. In this new video, we will tell you the details of one of the most unequal battles in the entire Gulf War. In just a few hours, lethal ships and heavily armed aircraft wreaked havoc, beginning to define the fate of a conflict that would not only mark the liberation of a country but also the map of enemies and allies between the West and the Arab world. Stay with us to learn about this incredible story.
Saddam Hussein started this cruel war against Kuwait. Tonight, the battle has been joined.
The history of this naval battle is part of a war that had taken its first steps some time ago. To understand the context, we must travel back to August 1990 when Iraq's army invaded Kuwait and, in a few days, managed to occupy its entire territory. The goal of Saddam Hussein's regime was to seize the oil production of the small emirate located on the shores of the Persian Gulf and, with it, to be able to face a huge external debt that had been generated during the war against Iran in the 1980s. However, things did not go as the dictator expected. The invasion generated great international rejection, to the point that tensions increased until they led to a military confrontation between Iraqi forces and a coalition formed by 34 countries, led by none other than the United States of America. Known as the Gulf War, one of the most remembered conflicts of recent decades began. Divided into several stages, the initial period was one of preparation and was constituted by the so-called Operation Desert Shield. The objective was to reinforce the defenses of Saudi Arabia to prevent an expansion in Iraq's ambitions within the region. In this way, the coalition could also establish bases near its enemy and be ready for when the time for action arrived. Little by little, the forces of different countries began to arrive at the location along with all their military equipment, so the first stage came to a close and the offensive framed in Operation Desert Storm was launched. January 17, 1991, marked the beginning, which started with aerial bombardments and a rapid ground intervention. But the ground and air incursions were not enough, as Iraq's interests did not end with oil production. The invasion by Iraqi forces was the perfect scenario to revive their border conflicts with Kuwait. These were centered on the sovereignty of the small Warba Island, with an area of 37 square kilometers, and Bubiyan Island with over 860 square kilometers. Both were under the control of the Kuwaiti government, and the latter was not only the most important in size but also the one that gave rise to the greatest naval confrontation of the war. The maritime action began during the early days when ships and aircraft from the United States, Great Britain, and Canada intercepted Iraqi naval forces as they tried to flee to Iranian territory. The invaders had made that decision after realizing that the coalition's actions involved a massive fleet in the Persian Gulf, and the disadvantage was too great to engage in battle. Following the example of the Air Force, which had managed to make that journey to stay safe, the Iraqi Navy attempted to follow in its footsteps and prepared to escape certain death. It set out to reach Iranian territorial waters, but unlike the aircraft, the ships of the regime led by Saddam Hussein encountered numerous obstacles preventing them from achieving their goal. On their part, the coalition forces were positioned with complete advantage to eliminate one by one the threats, such as armed oil platforms and Silkworm anti-ship missile sites, placed on the coasts of Kuwait and Iraq. They even managed to intercept an amphibious operation launched in the city of Khafji, which sought to reinforce the invasion. Great allies for this task were the Tomahawk cruise missiles, powerful and precise against long-distance targets. In this case, we can see how they were launched by U.S. ships like the USS Missouri. Now only the central objective of the Allies remained to be fulfilled, which consisted of damaging and destroying the different enemy vessels, specifically those with missile launching capabilities. During the night of January 29, the so-called Battle of Bubiyan finally took place. The brutal conflict began when a USA-6E intruder aircraft was conducting a reconnaissance mission and located 4 suspicious ships south of the Alfa Peninsula. The pilot of the aircraft noticed that what he saw was a group of patrol boats heading towards Iran with their lights off, but their nationality could not be determined immediately. Since several navies from different coalition countries were operating in the northern Gulf, prior confirmation was crucial to avoid friendly fire that could lead to an international incident. Identification arrived, and as expected, they were enemy ships. The A-6E was authorized to drop laser-guided bombs on 2 of the vessels and then requested support from an F/A-18 and 2 Canadian CF-18s to complete the destruction of the remaining ships. However, it was just the beginning of what would become the most important naval confrontation of the entire war. One day later, the efforts of the Iraqi fighters continued. A large group of ships based in Az Zubair and Mkazar joined the attempt to flee to Iran but was detected and attacked near Bubiyan Island. The battle lasted for 13 long hours and ended with a toll of more than 20 engagements against Iraqi Navy surface ships. On the coalition side, the main protagonists were the Lynx helicopters of the British Royal Navy, the CF-18 Hornets of Canada, and a variety of mostly American ships. Finally, the Allies managed to destroy a total of 21 enemy vessels, including Zuk-class patrol boats, T-43 minesweepers, Polokny amphibious ships, and TNC-45 missile boats. As the days passed, the war dragged on, but the announcement anticipating the end arrived. The coalition stated that the 13 Iraqi vessels capable of launching anti-ship missiles had been destroyed or rendered inoperable, and the invading naval force was considered ineffective in combat. Everything was lost, and escaping was no longer an option. The last attack maneuver by the Iraqi Navy, before being completely devastated, was the firing of 2 Silkworm anti-ship missiles from a ground launcher. The target was the U.S. battleship USS Missouri, but to the misfortune of Hussein's forces, one of the projectiles failed and fell into the water, while the remaining rocket was intercepted in flight by a Sea Dart missile fired from the British destroyer HMS Gloucester. The HMS Gloucester is a Type 42 destroyer of the Royal Navy, designed with an elongated hull that provides better navigation qualities and greater resistance. It was one of the most prominent ships during the Battle of Bubiyan, and the interception it carried out with a Sea Dart against an anti-ship projectile was the first successful missile attack against another. Its history can also be added to that of a major actor in the fiercest naval combat of the Gulf War. We're talking about the USS Theodore Roosevelt, the 4th nuclear-powered aircraft carrier of the American Nimitz class. This conflict was its first in action, and it did so in a great manner. It carried out around 4,200 sorties, more than any other carrier, and dropped about 2,000 tons of ammunition before the ceasefire on February 28. The Gloucester and the Roosevelt played an important role in completely eliminating all threats to coalition vessels in the Gulf. In fact, between the Battle of Bubiyan and a series of aerial attacks against port facilities, the Iraqi Navy ceased to exist with a total of 143 warships destroyed or severely damaged. There is no doubt that this outcome reflected the disparity between the forces under Saddam Hussein's command and the alliance led by the United States. This inequality was also evident in the toll of the Gulf War, which included the deaths of 30,000 Iraqi soldiers compared to less than 500 men lost from the coalition. As we approach the end of this video, we can assert that the resounding naval triumph was one of the keys to winning the war and convincing the Iraqi government to finally accept withdrawal from Kuwait, a country that regained its sovereignty on March 3 of that 1991. However, as we mentioned at the beginning, the conflict also left its mark on other aspects. The severe blow suffered weakened Hussein's regime, which was exploited by the Shia and Kurds to initiate rebellions in the south and north of Iraq. Furthermore, this was accompanied by a new role for the United States, which significantly increased its presence in the Persian Gulf to ensure the normal production and distribution of oil. Nevertheless, not everything was a gain for the Americans. Despite gaining an ally in Saudi Arabia, they faced strong resentment from the Arab world, from which various terrorist organizations drew strength to recruit new members and fortify themselves. Now, it's time to bid farewell. Thank you very much for joining us. We invite you to subscribe to our channel and stay tuned to meet again in our next military aviation video.